Back again for another enlightening history video, eh? Well, gear up, because this week we're talking about one of the most controversial groups of people in all of history. And I'm not talking about furries.
School days, dear old golden rule days, reading and writing and arithmetic, taught to the tune of a hickory stick.
No, I'm talking about ancient Rome. Now, whereas some people like to make a personality of the bloody conquest and oppression of Rome's military, today we'll be focusing more specifically on the social organization during the civilization's earlier days, before it got all empire-y, and really before it was very republic-y either. To do this, we'll be looking at a prolonged event called the Conflict of Orders. And no, I promise you that's not when you take your difficult aunt to the Cheesecake Factory. You see, the Conflict of Orders began shortly after Rome deposed their once king, Tarquinius Superbus, try saying that 3 times fast, for being quite casual about murdering his political opponents and allowing his son to perpetrate hideous crimes with impunity. Well, I guess what goes around comes around, because the Roman people decided that enough was enough. A powerful member of the king's inner circle named Lucius Junius Brutus, try saying that 3 times fast, capitalized on the outrage and led a successful coup against Tarquinius, joined by the Roman military and other noblemen. Tarquinius was exiled from Rome, and for a moment it seemed like maybe Rome had put their troubles behind them. Nope. In place of Rome's monarchy, the noblemen in charge decided to opt for a more democratic form of government, no doubt taking their cue from the Greeks. Because it's Rome. Like, literally everything they did was Greek. With some notable changes, though. In the words of historian Bertrand Russell, the Romans invented no art forms, constructed no original system of philosophy, and made no scientific discoveries. They made good roads, systematic legal codes, and efficient armies. For the rest, they looked to Greece. Remind me not to play with Bertrand Russell. He does not mess around. This new form of government inspired by Greek democracy was called a republic. You might find this word familiar, because you're living in one, baby. In a republic, representatives are chosen to represent the interests of the people. While it's fair to say that Rome benefited greatly from Greece's legacy of art and philosophy, it's unfair to ignore some of the important changes they made to what they took. If there was one quality that allowed Rome to achieve the staggering heights of power that they did, it would be adaptability. In the case of the Republic, Rome replaced the idea of citizens voting directly on government matters with citizens choosing skilled and intelligent representatives to make these decisions on their behalf. Whether that idea turned out to be the case or not is another matter. If you watch my video on Greek geography, it's probably fairly obvious that Greek architecture heavily influenced Rome. Even megastructures like the Colosseum would not exist without the precursory Greek amphitheaters. Though Roman advancements like the use of arches and concrete helped to boost these Greek influences to new heights. See what I did there? According to a Roman historian, Polybius, it was the ability of Roman engineers to pick apart and reverse engineer a ship of Rome's sworn enemy, Carthage, that helped them prevail in the First Punic War and become the premier naval power of the Mediterranean. And where would Rome be without importing their grain from Egypt and other locations throughout North Africa? Not Flavortown, that's for sure. But this is not to say that some of the things they adopted didn't have some unintended consequences. That is what we are going to discuss today. So let's get back to the whole conflict of orders thing we mentioned earlier. As with all revolutions, the noblemen of Rome who deposed Tarquinius Superbus were left to answer the question, what next? In a society that was still far from equal, an adoption of direct democracy from Greece, where each citizen gets a vote on any given issue, was out of the question. What they came up with melded more naturally with Rome's newfound distaste for kings, but also their tradition of placing power in the hands of the rich. You remember that awesome, totally perfect system we talked about, called a republic? Instead of citizens representing themselves, citizens would be represented by an esteemed group of citizens known as senators. Now, how were these senators chosen, you say? Were they voted for by educated citizens? Ha! No. Instead, senators were chosen by other fundamental roles within the newly formed republic. The consuls. The consuls were kind of like co-presidents of Rome, each with supreme civil, military, and religious power and authority. Wait, you say, isn't that dangerously close to a king for a civilization that just decided they hated kings? Well, yes. But it is worth mentioning that each consul had the power to veto or deny the other's actions. And as long as you have two, it's impossible for one to ever become king. Right? Right? Well, that's a story for another time. But for right now, let's stick with this new republic. There was a third part of the government known as the assemblies, in which normal citizens exercised some governmental power. However, it was extremely limited. For example, the Curiate Assembly was purely symbolic and only oversaw religious ceremonies. There was also the Centuriate Assembly, where male soldiers could vote on military matters, even having the exclusive authority to declare war. However, the system of voting in this assembly was still heavily rigged in favor of the richer and more powerful soldiers. The Senate was arguably the most important part of the system early on, as well as the oldest. Before the Republic was even formed, the Senate was a body of powerful noblemen who were originally appointed to advise the kings of Rome. But under the new Republic, the Senate gained significant power over both lawmaking and military decision-making. So we are taking the power that used to belong to one man and spreading it among hundreds of citizens. Pretty democratic, right? Wrong. For one, senators were not voted on by the people. They were appointed based on their status, and they kept their seat for life, or until one of their fellow senators stabbed them in the back. In addition to this, the Senate often had no real incentive for making their decisions in the best interests of the majority of Roman citizens. This is what we like to call an oligarchy, a system in which a small, powerful group of people share government power. So even with the newly formed system of government, the lion's share of power was still in the hands of the most wealthy and influential citizens. These citizens were known as patricians, from the Latin word pater, meaning father, as the patricians were the descendants of the original 100 senators appointed by the mythical founder of Rome, Romulus. Or that's at least what they claimed. On the topic of Romulus, let's gather around for a story time, shall we? A long time ago, in the kingdom of Alba Longa, there was a king named Numitor. Numitor was a fair ruler with a beautiful daughter named Rhea Silvia and a cranky younger brother named Amulius. Now, Amulius, as all cranky younger brothers of monarchs are, was dissatisfied with his older brother having all the power. And so he decided to depose his brother, steal his throne, and imprison him, making for a dramatic change in the ruling of Alba Longa and a very awkward family reunion. All that stood in Amulius' way of keeping his newfound power was Rhea Silvia, and the possibility of her having sons to replace him as king. To remedy the situation, Amulia forced Rhea to join the Vestal Virgin Priestess, where she would be banned from ever having children. Well, that's great and all, except for the fact that we're talking about ancient mythology here, and as much as the characters are intent on keeping something from happening, the gods are just as certain to make that very thing happen. So it was that the Roman god of war Mars descended from his lofty place in the heavens to father twin boys with Rhea Silvia and wreck Amulius' plan. Did Amulius just accept his fate and return the throne of Alba Longa to its rightful owner? Of course not. He yeeted those little brats into the Tiber River and kept that throne for himself. Now remember, those babies are not just ordinary babies. They're half-god babies, which means that of course they're not going to drown in the raging currents of the river. Instead, they washed up on the coast of the Italian countryside like Francis Ford Coppola. It was then that a she-wolf named Luperca, because obviously wolves have names, emerged from the wilderness and adopted the twins, resulting in this very odd statue to remind us that even god babies who can't drown need to eat. With help from their godly lineage and whatever health benefits derived from drinking wolf's milk, the twins began their own small settlement on the edge of the Tiber River and became natural leaders. And after learning of their true origins, they returned to Alba Longa to kill their great-uncle Amulius and restore Numitor, their grandfather, as king. Now successful and storied heroes, Romulus and Remus decided to return to the very spot where they washed up all those years ago to form their own proper city. But there was one problem, and it threatened the entire fate of their enterprise. They couldn't decide which hill to build the city on. With each brother preferring a different hill, they decided to learn their lesson from their great uncle and leave it up to the gods. Remus spotted 6 birds flying over his hill and claimed it was a sign of favor from the gods. That was until double that number of birds appeared above Romulus' favorite hill. Enraged, Remus decided to jump over the wall that was built at the base of Romulus's hill and was subsequently speared and killed by his own brother, or maybe some other guy. With any lingering threat from his dearly departed brother out of the way, Romulus would go on to found his city and name it for himself, Rome. Okay, now, back to the conflict of orders. You remember those greedy patricians, right? Well, they weren't the only class in the picture. In fact, the majority of Roman citizens belonged to a lower class called the plebeians. These were usually farmers, workers, and pretty much everyone else in Rome whose family tree didn't trace back to someone important. Life as a plebeian was considerably tough given that they lived in a society with no real voice or power to change anything. And to add insult to injury, many plebeian farmers were prone to debt and even slavery as a result of their military service. As Rome continued to fight and expand its borders, more and more male citizens were ordered to take up arms. With many of these citizens being plebeian farmers, they would be fighting at the expense of their own crops. After all, a farm without a farmer is just a field. Farmers returned to their farms after months or years of fighting and had nothing to show for it except debt. They would have to borrow money for supplies or bills from wealthy patrician landowners, sending them even further into the red. This was a vicious cycle that plagued many citizens, a cycle that was designed for the plebeians to lose. But this cycle would not last forever. In 494 BCE, just 15 years after the Republic was formed, the plebeians organized a resistance to fight the political and economic injustices that they faced. How so, you ask? By simply picking up and leaving the city. That's right, they said, "Oh, you think you're important, Mr. Fancy Pants Patrician? Let's see how you do on your own." They left their farms, their shops, and their homes to demonstrate their collective power. Over the course of hundreds of years, the plebeians would leave the city as many as 5 times in protest. This demonstration was incredibly effective, and it resulted in many changes to the Roman government, including the formation of a council where plebs could vote and elect their own representatives to protect their own interests, as well as the creation of the 12 Tables, which was Rome's first written set of laws. These laws were posted outside the Roman Forum for all to see, preventing the patricians from twisting or changing the laws to benefit themselves. The new laws made it so that plebeian citizens could hold any political office, including in the Senate or as consul. As we learn from the myth of Romulus and Remus, this was neither the first conflict between Romans nor the last. There were numerous civil wars between the differing sides of Rome throughout their history. In fact, if Rome is known for anything outside of Julius Caesar and aqueducts, it's fighting amongst themselves. Apart from providing us an important look into the functioning of Rome's government and class system, it also provides us an insight into the relationship between these two factors, a relationship that is not exclusive to Rome. There are examples throughout all of history that teach us the power of collective action to achieve political goals, whether it be thousands of years ago in ancient Rome or decades ago in the civil rights movement. The lesson is the same. Citizenship is an active process. In the words of famous orator, author, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. All right, well, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this insight into ancient Rome. And yeah, that's all I got.
Bye! We're good, bro. You can go.
To the left. Go Yak. Take it back now, y'all. Go Yak. One half this time. Go Yak. One half this time.
Yeah, well.
Would you look at that?
Yeah, there's a few more blemishes on the car.
Oh my gosh, just look at it.
Not around here, partner. Not around here. Not around here.
That's all I needed. That's all I needed for him to do that. And it became personal with me.